Chapter 25, After the Trial. With the trial behind me, I was looking forward to going back to prison. A few days later, though, while we were still in the county jail, wondering why we hadn't left yet, I overheard a couple of deputies talking. They said that CDC didn't want us back. Now that was a first, but early one morning, the county sheriff loaded the three of us up and drove us to Vacaville prison. They dropped us off like a bag of puppies and made a hasty exit. Once there, it was obvious that the administration didn't want us around other inmates. They feared we might be a bad influence on them. Because of who we were, the prison wasn't set up with the kind of security needed to house us. We were temporarily housed in ADSEG until they could figure it out. Within a week of our arrival, our transfer orders came in. Because of the notoriety of our case and our status in the organization, they didn't want us housed together. Bobo got his traveling orders to DVI Tracy. Larry went to Folsom, and I ended up San Quentin. Within a few weeks, we each went on our way. When I got to San Quentin, I was treated like a leper. They didn't want me in their prison either, so I was housed on death row with the condemned convicts. Whenever a new arrival comes to a new prison, he is automatically put on an orientation status for 14 days until he is seen by committee and housed appropriately. I was seen by a guy I knew from Soledad North a while back. He had been promoted to program administrator and oversaw the facility. He went over my very colorful central file at committee, and it was determined that I would be in high security for the next 18 months. I had no contact with anyone on death row or anyone in the family. This was the first time I was by myself without any NF. When I got to the small yard for exercise, there was a BGF member there, and he was telling me about East Block. There was a gang there called the Northerners. I wasn't familiar with them. I talked to staff about a move to East Block. For the next uneventful and long 18 months, I was on death row. When I was finally approved for the move to East Block, they put me on the second tier, 10 cells from the front. It's a 50-cell tier, and most of the inmates were kids, or maybe I was just getting old. I met a youngster named Toro from Modesto. He was bright and carried himself with strength. Toro reminded me of myself when I was his age. After a couple of weeks, I took him under my wing. I told him I was NF, and he told me he was in a group called the Northerners. He then told me that because I was older and more experienced, and due to my former rank in the NF, I was in charge. Everyone on the tier was in acceptance of this suggestion. Toro mentioned that there was another older guy they all thought was a little off in the gray matter area. His name was Tree, and they said he was an NF sympathizer and that he seemed dangerous. The others stayed away from him. I told Toro I wanted to meet this guy. After being on orientation for 2 weeks, I was finally released by the committee to go to the yard. I was given a grand tour by Toro and the rundown on who's who. I needed to get word to people on the streets and let them know where I was and that I was back in circulation again. Baba was still the general, even though he was at DVI Tracy. He would straighten all this out as our communication came back online through the grapevine. My current duty was to organize the second tier and start a new regiment from the ground up, as the Constitution outlines. That's what it was designed to do, to maintain the integrity of the organization. As mentioned earlier, the Northerners were born or established as the outer ring to act as an undercover shield to protect the inner ring of the NF from investigation from the authorities. Toro gave me little by little a breakdown of their group and how this offshoot branch of the NF had come to be in San Quentin. I went to the yard after breakfast one morning and met Tree. We introduced each other and like a couple of old dogs, sized each other up and down. We took a walk around the yard and he told me that he was 40 years old and ex-military special forces. He was about 6'3" and kept himself in good physical condition. He had received a 15 to life sentence for a shootout with the Oakland Police Department. Nobody was hurt or killed. He said he was just high on drugs and spaced out from flashbacks of the war. And yes, he was as dangerous as a rattlesnake. Nobody liked him and they kept their distance. After we talked, I got a better understanding of him. I took a liking to Tree. I guess it was because he was a soldier and we both shared similar interests. He also accepted me as his friend. Tree was later released after serving his time, and a couple of years later died happily while having sex. Hell yeah. Meanwhile, I appointed Toro to be my right-hand man. He had already proven his worth, and I saw him in the same enthusiasm and dedication that I had at his age. One afternoon, while out on the yard, I asked both Toro and Tree to meet me for a few minutes. Both guys had what it took. I had gotten to know them and had seen their dedication to me. So on this sunny, clear, and smoke-free day, I recruited both Toro and Tree into the Nuestra Familia. I was able to train and mold the two of them into good soldiers. My new and expanding regiment was off to a good start. One Friday evening at around 7 o'clock, 6 months into schooling and building this new regiment, my spirits took a lift when Babel, the general of the family, showed up in East Block. It had been over 2 years since I had last seen him, and I was glad to see him now. He was glad to see me too. We brought each other up to date, and he told me he had gotten into a fight at DVI, so he was transferred to Quentin. He didn't go into the details, and I didn't ask, other than the report he provided upon his arrival. The report is always expected from an arriving high-ranking member to the ranking member in charge. And because this was the general who was arriving, he too expected a full logistics report of the immediate regiment, which consists of the following information. 1. The status on each individual in the regiment. 2. Why they are here, details of what happened, how long a sentence they received, and whether anyone was hurt or killed. 3. Individual likes and dislikes, future plans, and full evaluations on each member. 4. How many weapons, knives are available and who is holding them. 5. Allies, BGF, and any others, enemies, MA and AB, and others in the immediate area. 6. The schedules and times of yard program, chow, etc. This report was due 5 days before Baba was to report to the facility committee. Talk about thoroughness. This is a definite sign of a well-run organization, one that will be around for years to come. Soon afterward, other members started showing up at San Quentin. Casper and Cricket from Salinas, Old Man Joker, a guy by the name of Wayne, who was the first white guy ever to be allowed in the NF, and other members, about 10 or 15, who didn't agree with the decision of the impeachment committee to impeach Babel. I knew that all hell was going to hit in time, but I had to wait and see. An impromptu election was held, and I was elected to be captain of the reinvestigation of the first impeachment. This was mainly because I had knowledge of more complete information than the first committee that was completely unaware of. The new information would change the outcome of the verdicts. Everybody was warned that absolutely under no circumstance was anyone to stab or start any of violence during this reinvestigation. Anyone who went against that order would be considered to have engaged in the act of treason and held accountable for interfering with an investigation and would be dealt with accordingly. With myself as the elected captain of the new impeachment hearing, word was sent throughout the state to other regiments and other prisons of this fact. It didn't take long for word to get back. 3 weeks later, Robert from Stockton came down from Old Folsom and informed me that I had overstepped my boundaries in reopening an already dead issue. He told me that the regiment at Old Folsom did not accept that I was reinitiating a new hearing and that they had accepted the current decision of the committee. Also, the Folsom regiment would not go along with any decisions made by a new impeachment committee. When I received this information, it was clear that they had already made up their minds and were not interested in hearing the truth, not even the facts of why this impeachment was brought about in the first place by Rabbit. So much for trying to do the right thing and bringing things into perspective. In the back of my mind, I knew I had ruffled some feathers, but I didn't know how badly at the time. At this point in time, the tension amongst Nuestra Familia members was starting to build. I had been assigned to lead porter position of East Block and oversaw laundry, inmate feeding, and other related tasks. Basically, I was given unfettered movement throughout the block and unlimited access to any of the 5 tiers in the building. I had hired Toro as my right-hand man because he was loyal and capable. Between the two of us, we knew who had the knives, where they were stashed, who had drugs, and when they were coming in, by whom, and from what visitors. I knew of every kite in East Block and what was in it, and more importantly, who came into or out of East Block for any reason. With this new information from the PA about all the NF members being moved to San Quentin, a big great red flag went up the pole. I gave everybody a heads up concerning the moves and ordered everyone to start making weapons and stashing them to the side, just in case. I knew that reopening the impeachment investigation could bring heat, and it could get downright bloody. I sent word to the regiments trying to explain Rabbit's motivation for initiating the impeachments and tried to explain why others hadn't accepted the reasons. It only fell on deaf ears. It seems that Rabbit was from Gilroy and was surrounded by some of his homeboys and others from Gilroy who supported Rabbit's decision regarding the impeachment proceedings. Later, they would be known as the Gilroy Boys. For the next 6 months, arguing went back and forth with a few troublemakers behind the scenes. It was obvious that Rabbit had set his sights on the general's position for himself when Baba was found guilty. It was all part of his agenda. But blinded by ambition to be the next general, he didn't see the bigger picture that was unfolding right in front of him. The Nuestra Familia had disbanded all the ranks and replaced them with the mesa, the table, which was to include only 6 members to act as leadership of the organization. In time, they would learn that something like that doesn't work. In East Block, a covert meeting took place on the 2nd tier to plan and execute a hit on a couple of troublemakers. It was an effort to bring them back into line and quit stirring up mischief by beating up the war drums. To keep from drawing attention, we went to the far end of the 1st tier and went up the stairs to the 2nd tier and to the last cell. That's where the meeting was to take place, right across from the cell where Tree lived. Tree, one of our own, was playing both sides of the fence. This was discovered when he accidentally let it slip to the opposing party of our plans to hit the malcontents. The opposition then armed themselves for battle based on Tree's information. Damn, his loose lips. If Tree only knew. The fuse he lit would ignite an explosion that would bring down the general. The hit was set up after Tree returned from the visit, which included him bringing in drugs from his visitor. It was cold and wet that day from a storm coming in off the bay. It was typical weather for this part of the state, and everything seemed normal out on the yard. The morning came and went without any problems, but the afternoon brought the hurricane of events that are described in the next few paragraphs. The tension was as thick as San Francisco fog on the yard as the afternoon rolled in. You could smell it in the air. If you've ever been in that kind of situation, you know what I'm talking about. You're aware of it in a sort of a sixth sense manner, but there is no one thing you can put your finger on. The feeling is inescapable. By 3 o'clock yard recall, it was like electricity, and I wasn't the only one feeling it. Everybody returned to their cells and prepped for the coming meal. After a brief body pat down, we were all allowed into the building and headed to our appropriate tiers. Toto and I were the last ones in so we could start our jobs as porters on the 1st tier. Casper was going to the cell on the 2nd tier and bent over to pick up his shower bag when it kicked off. 2 guys came up behind Casper and started stabbing him. He turned and started fighting back, getting in some good work on his assailants. Toto heard the commotion and looked up in time to see Casper get stuck. He got my attention and I looked up. He told me Casper just got hit. We both grabbed the rails and started a vertical climb toward the 2nd tier to help Casper. Meanwhile, also on the 2nd tier, Bobo had just left Casper's cell and turned back to say something when he saw what was happening. His adrenaline went into hyperflow and he launched at Casper's attackers with the ferocity of a wild bear protecting the family. Bobble's concentration was so focused that he didn't feel the wounds he received as he pulled one attacker off Casper and threw him down the tier walkway. Then he noticed the knife still stuck in his back. He pulled it out and tossed it over the rail toward Toro and myself as another attacker was heading our way. The melee continued as the guards sounded the alarm, alerting other guards who arrived with shotguns loaded with birdshot. One of the responding staff saw Toro and me in mid-ascent and fired a round of birdshot. It struck a steel beam to the right and ricocheted onto both of us. It caused us to fall about 10 feet to the floor below. That birdshot hurt like hell. I don't care what anyone says. We were both okay from the fall and scrambled up in time to see the knife that Babo had tossed. It dropped next to Toro. The attacker headed for us was a little late to the party. I yelled for Toro to grab the knife, and he got it in time to turn the knife on the celly. The expression on the enemy's face went from anger to surprise and fear. He did an about face and ran toward the 3 individual security cages at the end of the hall. He locked himself in one of them. In other words, he peed on himself. We were rushing him when another guard saw our intent and yelled for us to hit the ground. We complied. All around us, knives were being tossed like confetti in all directions to get rid of them. Not all were successful. Other shots were fired to bring the free-for-all to an end. When the smoke had cleared and the dust settled, Toro and I were escorted back to our cells in cuffs. As I walked to Casper's cell, I could see blood all over the place. He had been stabbed in his left shoulder and the artery had been hit in his leg. That's where most of the blood came from. He was placed on a gurney and carried to the infirmary where he was stitched up. He survived. Bobble proved to be one stubborn, tough dude. He had been stabbed in the chest and in the back. Luckily, they missed all the vital organs. When the gurney arrived to take him to medical, he looked at it and then at the guards and said, "This is nothing. I won't go out this way." He got up and walked himself under escort to the infirmary where he was patched up and lived to fight another day. That night after cell feeding, I had plenty of time to think. The whole East Block was unusually quiet. Even the crickets seemed to sense things weren't right. They were silent as well. I sat there on my bunk just staring at the wall. I was feeling despair, the feeling of a leader who had lost the lead. There was now a big split in the organization that was going to take a lot more than a band-aid to fix. I knew that I couldn't do anything. I could see the rift that was dividing the members and others, and it was only getting worse. I was thinking to myself, why am I fighting? I'm too damn old for this stuff. Nobody wanted to hear the truth, or at least the ones who should be listening didn't want to hear it. Is it worth it all? I found myself torn. I was caught up in a power struggle that would undoubtedly lead to more violence and bloodshed. While I still felt a strong dedication to the cause personally, because it's what I believed in, I was conflicted. Such were my thoughts as I drifted off to a fitful sleep. The next day brought more trouble for Toro when he got stupid and stabbed another inmate through the bars of the cell for threatening him the day before. This got him a DA referral and moved him to the first tier on total lockdown status. I lost a good right-hand man that day. I received a letter from Robert. He apologized about the hit on Babo and said that Casper was the target. He went on to say that the original impeachments cannot be undone and must be acknowledged and accepted by us to prevent future retaliation. He said that nobody wanted to go this far. He said that nobody wanted it to go this far. When I finished reading Robert's letter, I was still angry and upset. I didn't immediately respond back. I wanted to wait until Casper and Bob returned from the infirmary and had healed from their wounds. The PA called me into his office and informed me that the administration was considering separating the youngsters from the old-timers if we couldn't get along. The administration didn't have a clue that the fight wasn't about a generation gap, but rather an in-house dispute. It made no difference to them what the reasons were, though. They just wanted the violence to stop. 5 days later, Casper and Bobble were released from the infirmary, only to be moved to separate yards. They were not coming back. All of us were being sent to committee for rehousing to other yards to break us up. The administration thought this would help to quell the violence. I flat out told them I was not moving. I had been here in this prison a long time and had helped the administration keep things in order with the NF. This was my yard, and they owed me big time. They finally yielded to my request and let me stay. Cricket, another old-timer, also got a free pass to stay, probably to keep me company. As time went on, old man Joker cashed in his mind when he took some new high-tech drug known as Hot Shot. He went into convulsions and then into La La Land. He never came back. Joker was killed by a cellie at Corcoran State Prison. Wayne completed his term and was paroled to his new life and was never seen again. Two-timing Tree was moved to the yard Bobble and Casper were on. I'll bet the move made Tree uncomfortable. Most of the moves had been completed and the yard had a lot of new faces. Younger faces, meaning a new generation. Another 2 weeks came and went. I had started to get dirty looks from some of the other youngsters on the yard. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what Robert had written me in this letter. It was haunting. I'd always had been dedicated to the NF and been loyal to Bobble. This impeachment was a festering sore on my saddle. I knew I was right in trying to bring the truth to light. I believed that with it would overturn the verdicts of Bobble and Casper and expose Rabbit for what he was. To what end I was willing to pursue this future? How many more brothers were going to be maimed or killed due to my insistence to prove myself right? Yeah, I thought the same thing. After all these years plotting, planning, and fighting, it was time to throw in the towel. I was just tired of the fighting and bickering and looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. I was tired of all the responsibilities involved. And worst of all, I was tired of losing my good friends. My time as a leader of the Nuestra Familia had come to an end. I sat down one evening after chow and wrote a letter to Bobble, letting him know I had made my decision to retire from the NF. I explained to him and reminded him of all the past good years we'd had. But it was time to bail out. I was tired and it was starting to show. Bobble and Cricket both tried to talk me out of quitting and keep the investigation going, but both finally realized I was adamant about my decision. Bobble reminded me of the going away party, meaning the ass kicking I would have to endure for leaving the gang I was in. I told him that after all my 17 years of dedication, if they felt that this was the way it had to be, then bring it on. I just didn't care anymore one way or the other. My mind was made. God, it's a bitch to say goodbye. Cricket finally caved in and understood where I was at and accepted my decision. He told me he would have my back, but I wasn't looking for him to do that. The family was business, not personal, and everyone knew that. I went to the yard to inform everyone I was through and was resigning from NF. Not a good move on my part. One thing about leaders in gangs, when one leaves for any reason, there are at least 10 others waiting to take his place. Hector from Salinas just happened to be one of those guys bucking for status and position. I bet you he's talking about Hector Gallegos Copas from Salinas. He approached me on the yard one morning after my retirement speech and told me I couldn't come back to the yard anymore. I looked this wannabe gangster in the eyes and without a flinch told him, when you have walked in my shoes for as long as if I have, then and only then will I allow you to tell me I can't come out to this or any other yard. With that said, I turned around and walked in another direction, leaving him speechless and red-faced. I don't think he liked being put in his place, especially by an old-timer. I wasn't trying to disrespect him or anyone, but I wasn't going to let someone talk to me like that. One morning on the yard, I noticed a guy named Little Joker doing something out of his normal routine, which was usually sitting around shooting the bull with others in his little group. Joker was running in circles on the track. This guy never runs anywhere, let alone jog. It was so out of character, I just knew he had a knife wrapped up in his hand and was waiting for the right moment as he built up his courage to do what he had to do. I could have took it to him, but for what? He has his orders, and now it was up to him to follow them. Cricket came out to the yard and joined me as we waited for the supervisor in the laundry truck to arrive. A few minutes later, a guard shouted to us that the laundry had arrived and we were needed by our supervisor to come unload it. We were walking across the yard when Cricket was called over to where a group of 4 others were standing and talking. I kept heading for the gate. This was a ploy to get Cricket away from me, and he didn't pick up on it until it was too late. I wasn't as alert as I should have been. That is, until it was too late. I was focused on the task of the work ahead and didn't even duck when I felt a slight brush from behind. Then the warm trickle of blood coming from my left eyebrow. I brought my hand up to my face and confirmed it was blood. I looked around and saw Little Joker damn near flying on air to get away from me. My adrenaline kicked in, and as I turned to give chase with the intent to do some severe damage, the guard noticed the blood on my face and yelled at me to stop where I was. I did. Another guard saw what happened and came up to me. I had a black sweatshirt on, and he noticed that it was saturated around the collar. Upon closer examination, it was discovered I had a cut across my throat. The weird part about it is that I didn't even feel the cut when it happened. The assailant was good at what he did. I just didn't know how good he was. The cut across my throat was deep, almost too deep. I was in shock, induced by pride in part, but foremost, my bleeding on the inside. I grabbed a clean towel from laundry and put it around my neck to stem the blood flow. I had reached the rotunda on the yard where the guard called for a gurney for me. I told him I didn't need it. When it arrived, they talked me into it. I said I wasn't lying down, so I was carried to the infirmary sitting up. I guess I had forgotten I was in prison and had not stayed focused on what was going on around me. While en route to the infirmary, I was swallowing a lot of blood and my lungs were filling up at the same time. I was hurt worse than I thought I was. I was starting to have trouble breathing when I noticed the medical staff saw my distress and turned me on my side. Now, as they turned me, panic overwhelmed me as I started to vomit nothing but blood from my stomach and lungs. I started to see stars floating around in my eyes as my skin got damp and clammy. Then the lights went out and I lost consciousness. When I woke up a few hours later, the first face I saw was a Catholic priest leaning over me. Something told me I should have gone to confession more, and now it was too late. The priest told me I had indeed died, and he had given me my last rites. I looked up at him and said, "Nah, not yet." But then I thought, God's not finished with me yet, because I woke up. My mother and aunt came to see me and be with me at the hospital. They had been called because the doctors thought I wouldn't make it. But I reassured my mom that I was okay and that I would see her again at the prison visiting room. I spent 5 days at the outside hospital before being released to the prison. Then I spent another 5 days in the prison infirmary. While resting and recuperating, I started to think again. Why? Here I was, stuck, stitched, and now convalescing. All this after giving 17 years of my life dedicated to the NF. All I wanted to do was retire, quit, and go away. It's not like I was asking for a gold watch or anything special. If I had a clue that this was the way a senior dedicated leader was going to be treated, I probably would have considered a different retirement plan. But I knew what I was getting into 17 years ago when I joined the NF. There was nobody to blame but myself. That's life in prison. After the 5th day in the infirmary, I was returned to East Block where I kicked back and relaxed. Within 2 days, I was back before the institution committee and informed that due to my age, 37, I was being moved to the integrated yard where Bobo and Casper were. I agreed with the decision of the committee and was moved by the end of the day. Cricket was already over there. He'd been moved for his own protection and because of his age. I know what you're thinking. We got moved to a gigantic ward or yard. Let me tell you this. Back on that yard, maybe we did sit around. But it was at a meeting where we declared an all-out war on anyone from that yard, which we come. Furthermore, we would take any one of them out on sight. Of course, anybody from outside the prison group who saw this probably thought a bunch of old geezers had a suicide pact. We're talking about a bunch of very seasoned NF members who were more venomous than a pit of vipers. Those youngsters would get first-hand schooling if given the opportunity. Then, one beautiful sunny summer day, a couple months later, karma occurred, or should I say opportunity happened. Somehow, the administration had inadvertently transferred 2 young gangbangers to the integrated yard. Oops, the new arrivals were already on the yard, which is the size of a half a football field. My tier was the last to be released. The 2 gangbangers were at the restroom area, which has a 4-foot brick wall surrounding it for a little privacy. There's no roof and it's open so the guards can see the area. As the youngster stood point, the other was on the commode in the process of removing a knife that he had secluded in his derriere. That's gotta be uncomfortable. In the meantime, a guy named Sundown from Oakland had recognized the 2 from the other yard and ran over to tell me about the newcomers. As I came out, I saw the whole yard of convicts lined up on the opposite side, the length of the yard and the width at one end staring intently at the commode area. When the 2 youngsters finally realized what was happening, they got very anxious and wide-eyed. It looked like a pack of wolves circling their prey. The guards noticed what was happening and let it unfold before them while they watched with interest. Then at the drop of a hat, 7 to 10 convicts broke out of the line, with Sundown in the lead. They hit it right at the 2 guys. The youngsters stood their ground with defiance, putting the bravest face on that they could muster up, but knowing that it was the last day that they'd ever see. A guard fired his Mini 14 rifle and hit Sundown in the leg. I saw him go down and ran over to pull him back up as more warning shots were being fired. Everybody hit the ground as if it were rehearsed. One of the gangbangers tossed the knife that he carried around so uncomfortably for so long. Staff ended up finding it, however. After the dust had settled, there were no casualties or other injuries that day, except for the 2 very soiled boxer shorts. That was one day I know of when 2 lucky guys truly appreciated the guards. As long as they live, I bet they'll never underestimate old-timers again. After that incident, things calmed down a lot, and we were once again getting back to normal. A new prison, California Correctional Institution at Tehachapi opened. It was specially designed for gang members only. It was a new design with only 2 tiers per building, some with built-in satellite kitchens between 2 buildings. It was all enclosed. Everybody knew they were leaving San Quentin. Baba was sent to Tehachapi and Tree had gone to Folsom. The gangbangers from the other yard were moved to CCI. Cricket paroled but came back with a 25 to life sentence. That left scatterbrained old man Joker and himself, the only ones left. Because everyone was being transferred to other institutions and with new people coming in to replace them, for the next few years I lost contact with everyone. I was lonely. I almost lost contact with my wife, family, and the old NF crowd. I had no ambition to continue down this path or to be involved with the organization. Then it was my turn to leave. I was bounced around from one institution to another and eventually ended up at the California Medical Facility at Vacaville for the next 3 years. Finally, I was released back to the mainline. That was a nice change. Everything was fine. I was working at R&R and doing okay. Then in 1990, I screwed up again and found myself in familiar surroundings. I was back in the hole for being too friendly with female staff. That caused me to be sent to Folsom, where I ran into Bobo and Tree. I was happy to see Bobo again, and he was too. I recalled what Tree had done years before and wasn't so enthused to see him. I'd tell him when the three of us were all together. A meeting was arranged with just the three of us, and I pulled no punches. I got right to the point about how reliable and varied sources had confirmed that it was Tree who let slip to the opposing party about the confidential meeting we had about setting up a hit on them. This in turn was the cause for Casper and Bobo getting stabbed in East Block. Tree was outed, and he knew it. He shuddered for excuses and failed, but didn't deny it either. From that day forward, I've never spoken to Tree. Bobo, on the other hand, harbored no ill feelings towards Tree, even after knowing the facts of what had set off the violence that day that ended up getting him stabbed. Bobo told me it's just something out of the past, let it go. So it was basically just the three of us now, and the last of the original senior NF leaders, and we should stick together. I went along with Bobo's reasoning, but this did not mean I had to talk to him or to be his friend. I just put up with him. After 2 years at Folsom, I noticed that Bobo was getting thinner and was losing weight. I mentioned this to him and he said he was just getting old. He wasn't feeling ill or anything, but did put in a request to see the doctor for an annual checkup. The doctor ordered tests, and when the results came back, he was called to medical. I ran into him on the yard when I brought him extra food for my kitchen job. I asked him what the doctor said. He told me he was going in for some exploratory testing, a biopsy on his esophagus. I asked him what the doctor said. He told me he was going in for some exploratory testing, a biopsy on his esophagus. The next week, he was taken to the hospital for the biopsy, and 2 days later, he returned. When I got off work that evening, I brought him some food to try to fatten him up. He thanked me and put on a cheery face, but after 20 years of knowing someone, you can see right through the facade. No matter how much food I brought him, he continued to lose weight. I was getting more and more concerned. We were on the yard one evening, and when they called the in-out line, he told me not to go in, so we walked the track. I could sense he wanted to talk, so I just waited. He dropped the bomb and told me he was going to die. I tried to laugh that one off. We were always kidding one another, and I thought he was joking around. And not this time, though. Bobo was like a brother to me, and always had been since the day I met him. He told me about the exploratory biopsy and how when the doctor opened him up, they discovered he had cancer in his throat, probably from all those years of smoking. His condition was made worse when they opened him up. It made the cancer spread faster. They told him there was nothing they could do and gave him 3 to 6 months to live. Even after he told me, I didn't want to believe it. He's my friend, my brother, and I kept telling myself he wasn't going to die, but the look in his eyes confirmed it was true. I felt greater sadness overcome me as the gravity of the situation sank in. He gave me his wife's phone number just in case. Bobo also considered me part of his family. He told me to find Larry and transfer to where he was so I wouldn't be alone. He wanted me to be with someone I knew when he died. Bobo made trips back and forth to the hospital for treatments. His spirit was high, but his weight kept dropping and he was getting thinner. In the next few weeks, he could hardly talk because of the pain. He tried to keep a smile on his face, but his darkened eyes and the loss of weight told a different story. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, pulling the U.S. into World War II. Admirals and generals were called into action to defend the United States. This date was also just as important for another kind of general. I was on the yard that morning, and after a while, Tree came up to me and told me that Bobo had gone to the hospital. An hour later, I was called to the program office, and the PA, a guy I knew from DVI Tracy, told me that Bobo had died. I was shocked to hear those words, even though I knew to expect them. He said he was sorry, and I thanked him for telling me privately. When I left the office, I was numb and lost for words. I knew people were all around me on the yard, but at the same time, I was totally unaware of any noise or sounds from anyone. I felt welling tightness stir in my head and chest. I headed for the bleachers, which I noticed were empty at the time, and sat down to think about what had just happened. My mind went into rewind through all the yards and good times me and Bobo had shared. From the time he took me under his wing, he trained me and through his guidance taught me to be a leader. My anguish and compassion for my brother flowed from my eyes as I breathed heavily into my hands. After a few moments, I looked up out onto the yard through tear-filled eyes. The yard seemed to go completely empty before me. Then, one by one, old dead soldiers started to appear off in the distance, coming closer. These same soldiers I fought side by side with for what we believed in and trained for all these past years. They were soldiers that I had loved and respected for so long, that were no longer with me. They all looked at me with smiles on their faces as if to say they won the battle. And then Bobo appeared before me as he had looked in his younger years. He stood proudly with the look of the general he was. And then I remembered something Bobo once told me, a quote from another famous general. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away.